Okay, everyone's here. If you could just mute yourselves while we start, and when you're not speaking, that would be great. Okay, thanks everyone. So people are just starting to drift in. The numbers are going up, so I'll just give that a minute to let people join the session before we start formally. I've got really good turnout. Just wait till the numbers sort of steady a bit and then start. Marilyn Anderson has raised her hand. Okay, the numbers are still going up, so I'll just give it a second. Okay, I think we should be ready to start now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event, which is hosted by the Centre for Intimate and Sexual Citizenship at the University of Essex. So this exciting roundtable will bring together a leading group of scholars and writers in the field of female masculinities, or gender identity, who will share their thoughts and reflections on gender, politics, and queer community. And this is one of the events that we're hosting as part of LGBTQ+ History Month. And it also marks the upcoming publication of a new edited volume, Queering Desire, Lesbians, Gender and Subjectivity, which will be out shortly. And some of the contributors to today's event have chapters in that volume. So this roundtable is the first in a series of roundtables that will be hosted by the Centre. Today's session is scheduled to last 90 minutes, which includes some time for questions from the audience at the end. And please note that the Centre is supportive of diversity, including bi, queer, trans, and non-binary identities. And we expect that any questions posed using the Q&A function will reflect the ethos of the Centre and the university's regulations. So without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our wonderful speakers, all of whom have written about gender, butch, masculine, and centre experiences. So in alphabetical order, Dr. Libro Levi-Bridgman is a European writer based in London who's written for the Theatre and BBC Radio 4 and has a Ph.D. from UEA in creative writing. They're renowned for their theatre production, The Butch Monologues, and they're currently working on screenplays. Our next speaker is Professor Esther Newton, who is one of the absolute founders of queer anthropology and has written numerous renowned books, including Cherry Grove, Fire Island, 60 Years in America's First Gay and Lesbian Town, Margaret, Mead Made Me Gay, and of course, the memoir, My Butch Career. In 2018, she received a Distinguished Achievement Award from the Association of Queer Anthropologists of the American Anthropological Association. Currently, she's the subject of a documentary film, Esther Newton Made Me Gay. Yassine Senghor is an EDI facilitator, mentor, speaker, consultant, writer, interviewer, host, sensitivity coach, podcaster, and her areas of expertise are LGBTQ+ inclusion, building inclusive communities, creating anti-racist spaces, and approaching EDI through an intersectional lens. And you will also may know their work through the social media handle Big Black Butch Bitch. Our next speaker, Jill Taylor, is the author of 4 collections of poetry. Her most recent collection, Canto and Other Poems, won the 2021 T.S. Eliot Prize and was nominated for other awards as well. She is also a former UK slam champion, and she founded the National Youth Poetry Slams Slambassadors in 2001, remaining its artistic director until 2018. She is a co-curator and host of Outspoken Live and resident at the South Bank Centre. Her novel of interconnecting stories, The Night Alphabet, was recently published. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the 2022 Saboteur Spoken Word Artist of the Year. And then our final presenter today is Dr. Frances Ray White, who is a reader in sociology at the University of Westminster. Frances's work is interested in theorizing gender at the intersections of fat, queer, and trans embodiment. Their previous research has been published in books and journals, including Fat Studies, Sexualities, Somotechnics, and the Routledge International Handbook of Fat Study. So as you can see, a really impressive lineup of speakers here. So the format that we're taking for today's roundtable is that we have a series of questions that the speakers will then sort of discuss among themselves. So the first is, how do you all personally identify in terms of female masculinity? And Esther, maybe you'd like to kick it off since you're first on my screen.
I just had to be sure to unmute. So I identify as butch for historical reasons, and also because it has such a proud history, and also because I fought so hard to get there. I just wanted to, something that really helped me along the way was the work of Sally Munt. And I just wanted to read one short sentence of hers. She says, "The butch is either the magical sign of lesbianism or a failed, emasculated, and abjected man." And that gave me a lot to think about. And sort of the core sentence from my memoir that for me encapsulates what butch is. Butch is a gender identity within lesbian culture that fuses female masculinity with homosexual desire. So I am okay with transmasc, but that's not my primary, it's not the primary way I think about myself.
Thanks. Joel, do you want to go next? You're muted, by the way.
Hello, sorry about that. Yes, I think my identity is pretty much like Esther's. Again, for historical reasons, because that was the fight I had. I identify as a butch dyke. Dyke's a really important part of it, as important as butch, and I see it as quite a radical space. And it struck me that what Esther was saying about either this kind of powerful lesbian or magical lesbian or a failed man, it's quite a powerful thing to say. I mean, for me, to be a butch dyke, to be woman, is the radical space because it's the space I fought for. But equally, I absolutely, honor and revere non-binary, transmass, masc of center, and all the new understandings of it. And I'm really excited about this roundtable because we get to talk in an honest and loving and tender way to each other. And, we're part of the same bloody rainbow. So, yeah, let's shine.
Thanks so much. Frances, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi. I mean, on an everyday kind of way, I at the moment say I identify as non-binary, but it's complicated. I'm not in love with that term. I do a lot of research using that term, but I don't love it. I don't really identify as either female or masculine. I've over the years toyed with butch, but I'm not sure I can really pull it off. I think maybe I'm just too much of a fancy boy. Like, I don't know. It's not quite. It does not. I don't know. I'm attracted to it as a concept, and I love it. And again, like you were both saying, that the history of it is something that has informed, who I am, and I'm in love with that. But I'm not sure that's what I am. But yeah, so I struggled for a long time with kind of carving out a space within being a woman to be something else, and that's what being a lesbian always meant to me. And at a certain point, I have sort of tipped over into being some kind of trans, but it is a very complicated and grey kind of area, and I'm not fully sold either way. So yeah, it's female masculinity is a complicated space for me. Yeah.
Thanks. Yassine, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of echoing a lot of what people are saying, it is definitely complicated. And I always feel like I'm on a bit of a journey, and in some ways have been on that journey my entire life, but maybe it's become more kind of sharp focused at the moment, just because I think I have more control over perhaps how I'm perceived in the image of myself that I'm putting out into the world. I think growing up, there was a lot of, I think, stuff that I was internalizing based on how other people perceived me or the labels that people put on me. And so, yeah, like from when I was a kid, I've always been a tomboy, or, and as growing up was always like masculine of center or masculine presenting. And so in many ways, I kind of would like, I guess, internalize ideas around what it is then to be masculine or male or whatever that means. But obviously, in many ways, that was often very negative associations, and kind of, the kind of role models and people that I had to model myself on were these perceptions of, in my case, very particularly Black masculinity, which was not necessarily portrayed in the best light often. And so there was a lot of times where I would see myself kind of borrowing a lot of traits and things that didn't necessarily align with me, but that was the kind of image that was put forward to say, well, this is what masculinity is, and if you're going to be like, tough or whatever, that's what that means. I think as I've gotten older, I'm far less concerned with what other people think of me or how other people see me. And so I'm a bit more maybe comfortable in myself and how I present, how I am. So I often define myself as being a gender non-conforming woman. For some people, that puts me under the trans umbrella. For other people, it doesn't. And, fine, whatever that means to you. I think for me, I'm not necessarily as concerned with where I fit because I do feel more comfortable in myself and confident in myself. So if, you asked me about my relationship to gender and stuff, we could go into that. We could go really deep about that, but I don't necessarily feel like I need to fit in under an umbrella to know myself or to feel validated or justified in myself. But at the same time, obviously, I understand why some of those labels and that umbrella is so essential and integral for so many people. But I think for me, in some ways, it almost felt like people were boxing me in with that. And in terms then of how I kind of engage with my masculinity or ideas around that now, I call myself like a sissy dyke or a dandy or a fop. I'm very camp. I'm very like people immediately when they see me, they automatically go, "Oh, you're going to be like butch and hard and stuff." And I'm like, "No, you're very mistaken. I'm very much not that. I'm a bit, So yeah, I think, but that's been a bit of a journey to get to that stage and to be able to be comfortable enough to, fully present that all the time, and without kind of having to navigate other people's perceptions. So yeah, I think it's still an ongoing thing, but I am more comfortable in whoever I am now, I think.
Great, thank you so much. Libro? Libro, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm coming. Yeah, actually, that's brilliant to go last because I'm kind of steal everybody else's responses a little bit and sort of mush them together. I mean, I feel kind of quite close to nearly everybody's experience. I also feel at this present time like non-binary, dandy, but within my sort of growing up, I'm going to be 57 in April. So in terms of my history, Joelle and I have kind of been making theatre work back in sort of the early 90s, late 80s. It felt like the term butch, androgynous tomboy was really important and really critical, but it feels like now that my relationship to that term has slightly shifted. I also feel sometimes it's relative. Sometimes I'm sitting next to somebody I feel like the campus thing since sliced toast. And then sometimes, do you know what I mean? Sometimes my masculinity feels a bit more dialed up. In terms of this idea about femininity and masculinity, I think Tabs Lucy, who runs Butch Please, has got an interesting take on it, even though it's not my lived experience, but this idea of being a different kind of woman or a new sense of femininity. And I think that is incredible, actually, to take what is perceived to be a masculine space or a butch space, but also flip that and say, but it's also a feminine space and a female space, and to embody that and say that it's a new form of femininity. So I think these are quite radical positions, which I think are really exciting. And, listening to Esther as well, and just saying, actually, back in the day, it was really hard, like contested land. Like you had to be butch, you had to be defined as butch and lesbian in order to feel that your gender identity was somewhere in your kind of control. and it was legitimate to you, and to make it legitimate to other people. But I think we're living in times where things are flipping up and turning around, and I think you can be butch, obviously butch, lesbian, trans, non-binary, all within the same sort of conversation. I think that is really exciting. It feels a bit disorientating, but I also think it's really exciting that we can deploy these terms and also throw them away, hold them close, throw them away, throw them against the wall, take them back again, and still have a different conversation. Next week we could have a different conversation. I think that's all to our power, really.
Great, thanks. Joel, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just Libro, what you said then I found quite thrilling, because that's kind of my experience. This is the phrase female masculinities kind of doesn't make sense for me, because it's all the broad range of what woman is. It's a kind of woman. I'm a kind of woman. Why then is this masculine? Why are we saying it's that? I mean, like, let's face it, I can't play pool. I don't know what a car is. You know, the only thing I am that's butch is emotionally unavailable. You know, that's all I've got to bring to the game. So I kind of understand this as being a part of this vibrant experience of whatever this thing is, female or woman, say that.
Well, that kind of brings us nicely into the next sort of question, which is about how do you view female masculinities as a concept, which I think was kind of embedded in what a lot of what you were saying earlier. So just feel free to jump in. Yassine?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, flows on from that last point that you both were making there. I very much, from when I was young, had this impression, and sometimes was very directly told, that I was a bad girl. I was a bad woman. I wasn't doing it properly. And it's exactly this kind of what this journey of self-acceptance has been, is that sense of, actually, like, womanhood is so vast, and especially actually as a Black woman, or person perceived to be a woman, raised as a woman, so often just in that level, that element of Blackness, what Black women, even more feminine Black women, are told that they are not woman enough, right? And so when you have somebody who is butch, who is a stud or whatever, there is that additional point of, right, okay, almost like having to go to the other side and say, right, well, if, like, I'm not going to be a good woman, then I guess the only other option is to be, as was stated earlier, I guess, a bad man. But ultimately, of course, it's not that simple, because, you know, the binaries are made up. They're not how things, you know, should be. They are very much put in place to keep us in these boxes. And so, yeah, I really, really related to that, and just like felt quite like compelled as to add my little bit to that, because that's exactly the issue, is that, like, actually, when we talk about masculinities, a lot of the time I don't really relate to that idea at all. Like, nothing about my, I guess, what would be called masculine presentation has anything to do with maleness or traditional ideas of masculinity. Actually, it, like, I have very little to do with men in my life, for better or worse, and so it doesn't relate to that at all. Especially, you know, a lot of the kind of negative associations with masculinity that are then, I think, self-imposed or co-opted, or sometimes imposed on us as more masculine presenting or butch women. So yeah, I don't know if that was a fluid kind of coherent thought, but I was just kind of going off what was said there.
Thanks so much. Libra, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, just going from what Yassine's just raised as well, like, where are these ideas about, you know, good woman, good man, bad man? It feels also that's coming from sort of a white heterosexual male like culture as well. So, like, how can we possibly even like acknowledge those terms, because they're not terms that we've put maybe potentially we're using them for ourselves because we feel we're disrupting what that perception is, but they're not terms that we've self-generated. And I think that's, you know, this idea of good and bad, well, there's a whole other thing attached to that, obviously, the sort of legitimacy of that, but also woman and man, like, what are these terms and what do they mean, and how can we possibly, as queer people or people that are gender diverse, how can we possibly relate to them, and who's like dictating what a good man is and what a bad man is. And so I understand completely what you're saying, Yassine, as well. It feels like they've been shoved on us and we're trying to then kind of work out how we fit in and how we acknowledge or how we push against what these terms are, when we didn't even want these terms in the first place, because they didn't make sense to us ever, did they?
Would anyone else like to add their thoughts on female masculinities as a concept, Frances?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Libra, about these terms being terms that not terms that we have chosen to define gender or sexuality, or how those things might pan out for us. And I think like female masculinities now, because I think of Halberstam's book, and when was that, like 1998? It's a long time ago in kind of queer time, and how at the time that felt like kind of bringing together of two things that shouldn't be together, the female with the masculine, right? And it expressed a certain kind of thing, and now it feels like that is too narrow a term to encompass people who we've all talked about, non-binary and transmasc, all of those kinds of things, people who might not be female. It doesn't quite kind of work anymore. And I think there is something, for me, something problematic about the term female masculinities in what is the female part of that kind of referring to. I'm not kind of sure anymore, because so sort of like, why hang on to that kind of binary when we've kind of deconstructed it? Do we need it at all? So then why is there anything useful in kind of keeping any of those terms? Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, I find it a funny term now. I'm not sure.
Esther? Esther, you're muted.
I tried to put my little digital hand up, but maybe it doesn't work when you're muted. But anyway, I guess as someone trained, partly as someone trained in the disciplines of history and anthropology, I don't think these terms like man and woman we can't just individually, I mean, we're sort of trapped in it. Not sort of, I mean, so many terrible things have happened to me in my life because I was seen as a woman, before that, a girl. And that those gender categories, they're really powerful, and they're still really powerful. And on the one hand, I'm very interested in how you young folks, which you all are from my perspective of 83 years old, are struggling with all this. But on the other hand, as I said, and another way that I come at this is my involvement in second wave feminism, which was an incredibly powerful movement and resulted in all kinds of changes, I presume in Great Britain, but certainly in America that I'm familiar with, overturning the abortion ban, and and on and on and on, stuff that came out of the feminist movement. And then and the whole concept there was, well, we're women and we're proud of that, and we're going to advance the rights and visibility of that category. So that's, having been part of that movement, which has been not as much second wave feminism, but certainly lesbian feminism, has been disappeared totally from the historical landscape. And now even within queer culture, it's characterized solely as, oh, they're trans exclusive, the movement was so much more interesting than that, and so much more. And I became alienated from it after 3 or 4 years because it was going in directions that, for various reasons, I didn't want to go in. But in the beginning, it was unbelievably powerful because before that, we had been so isolated. I mean, even to put together a little friendship group where then everyone would sleep with everyone because that was the only option, and then suddenly the whole world opened up for us. By us, I'm saying the people that I knew at that time were middle class, or in some cases upper class, white, people who identified as lesbians or dykes. And it just burst the world open. And all of a sudden, we met all these fabulous people, and Audre Lorde, and, people like that were just so amazing. And plus lots more partner opportunities, that because all these women who before had identified as straight started saying, well, maybe I'm going to experiment, or maybe I'm a lesbian, or I am a lesbian, very militantly or whatever. And a lot of them were really cute, so yeah, anyway, these are some thoughts I have about this discussion.
Thanks so much. Well, that kind of brings us into the next question then, which is how does your gender identity, or terms like butch or masculine center or queer, non-binary, whatever, how do they inform the work that you do? Who wants to go first?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, it's been central to my work my whole life because I've literally been there writing it. So I'm literally there. But it's taken some very different forms. So, like Libra was mentioning earlier on, we worked together back in the late 80s, early 90s doing theatre. During that time, all my work was around the kind of what we'd call now the queer experience. But for me then was the sort of dyke, gay, feminist experience. So I was part of a women's physical theatre collective called Spinster. So, again, to pick up on what Esther was saying, it was very, very core to us, even at that time, that we were part of the feminist movement. So my work really centered, sometimes very explicitly. I wrote about a character called Billy McCree back in the mid-90s, who was what we'd now call transgender, but at the time we were still we'd call Billy now non-binary, I think, because the whole idea in the story is that Billy was on the journey, never arriving, but in this sort of liminal space. And then I set up Slambassadors, and that's very different because I'm one of those dykes, that is, I've never had to come out, put it that way. Sometimes I've lied and said I'm straight just to look at the shock on people's faces, but I've just always sort of looked this way. So leading this huge national competition and being on stage, well, I was, as Hannah Gadsby said, I was there the entire time. So whether or not I was speaking about it, I was, indoctrinating a generation of young poets into believing that people like me had a place to be there. It was part of it. And now, since writing Conto, it's become, it's something I want to write more and more and more into. And maybe some of that is to do with history. It's to do with loss of friends. It's to do with remembering the best nights out I've ever had and wanting that for a younger generation as well, So it's very central. But woman is very central too, in terms of even the form I write in. I try to write in the feminine morphology, in that kind of shape, rather than the sort of linear masculine kind of thing. That makes sense.
Absolutely, thanks. Who'd like to come in next? Frances, do you want to share your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, yeah, this was a really interesting question because I don't know that female masculinity as a term informs my work, but my work is about gender, and I'm, doing this project on non-binary people in higher education, which is, we did a survey, and we allowed people to self-fill in their own genders. We had 93 different formations of gender, and that's just non-binary people, right? Or the scope of people who don't identify as male or female. So it's like there's a lot of and that's, to me, is kind of one of the most exciting findings. So yeah, and I've done been part of this other big project about trans pregnancy, which again is like a lot of people are getting pregnant, but they identify as male or transmasculine or non-binary or something that's not a woman. And so I'm kind of researching the kind of multiple forms and combinations that gender can take. And then I think in my work on fat studies and the intersections of fat and gender, I'm interested in like how gender comes to exist at all, in a kind of embodied way, and so that sort of involves femaleness and masculineness kind of all together. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of question, and it's definitely there in everything that I do, but in sort of diffuse ways, maybe.
Thanks. Yassine, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I did find this an interesting question, because I think it's not something that I consciously do. I think a lot of my work is sort of based on my own experiences and drawing from my lived experience of things, drawing through from, like, I often joke that I am intersectionality personified, that there's like so many different characteristics that I kind of represent. And for some people, I am like maybe the kind of stereotypical example of what some of those identities might be. So a lot of people automatically will like they, them, me, because they'll just assume that I'm non-binary, which, I have, that's kind of a bigger conversation, but like, fine if you want to do that. But sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought. Because it's so kind of based on my experience, my identity, I think it's inevitable that whatever I do will be being informed by my experience of the world as being a, I guess, masculine presenting person, regardless of how I identify with masculinity or whatever. Again, it's a lot about how people perceive me. So a lot of it maybe maybe I am consciously putting out a different representation or a different understanding of what people might perceive when they automatically look at me and think they know something about me. So I think in that sense, it's sort of happening in everything that I do, but not necessarily in a way that I am conscious of. Although, I don't know, I guess, like you said about my Instagram handle and stuff, Big Black Butch Bitch, I started it because that was literally something that somebody had just called me, and as like, and as an insult. And I was like, actually, the alliteration on that is perfect. I'm taking that. I'm stealing it. But also, like, there's, I think, and this happens a lot in our communities, there's like a reclamation there. There's a finding power in this language of these words that are meant to demean you. And so for me, I think it comes through in my work because it comes through in my life and how I think I'm trying to live my life. And so that then, it flows into everything that I do. And I think, I hope, or yeah, that's the goal of it, at least, is that I'm always drawing from that perspective, but maybe trying to put forward a different understanding or a different interpretation of what people might traditionally associate with butchness, masculinity, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks. Esther, do you want to?
Well, my first professional work was on drag queens, and this was in the 1960s, and it was part of my own coming to terms with myself process, big part. And I think I had this sense of myself as being a female impersonator. Not that I was campy, I'm not. I wish I were, but it was this role that had been stuck on me, and I hated it. But I had the circumstances that I was in, I had to try to conform to it. And I did try to conform to it for a number of years. And in that way, I came to identify very strongly with female impersonators. It's kind of around the bush, but so female masculinity, I couldn't present or even accept myself as what I felt myself to be, but they were presenting themselves as what they felt themselves to be. And I identified with that hugely. So that was kind of a starting point in my professional career. And then again, my book on Cherry Grove, has historically been a gay male dominated community. And because of my work on drag queens and my admiration in some ways for gay male culture, I didn't have any problem interacting with them or understanding what they were saying. I did write ultimately a piece about a longtime community member, Dyke, who dressed up as a drag queen to become Miss Cherry Grove, or Miss Fire Island, I guess the title was. And I just found that so interesting. And then ultimately, my memoir, which is really My Butch Career, which is really about my sense of myself that was both suppressed and attacked. I have been physically attacked for the way I present and for holding hands with a woman. So that was a very important piece of work for me. And then the film, which is not my work. I mean, it's not my film, even though I'm the central character in it. And it was wonderful to feel so, I'm late 70s, early 80s, to feel so comfortable in my skin that I could, and Jean said, "Oh, you're a really good film subject because you're unfiltered." But that brings me back to the, no filter. It brings me back to what I think Libro said, or was it Libro or was it Joel who said, "Oh, what I identify with as being emotionally unavailable." I found that as hilarious. And thank you for saying that.
The Libro, I think you want to respond.
Yeah, I suppose just in terms of my relationship with making work around gender and sexuality, I worked for a lesbian theatre company back in the 80s called Red Rag, and we did stuff at the Oval House Theatre, and I was in some lesbian farce called Ooh Mrs. So, and I was playing like the butch, sporty character, although I wasn't sporty at the time, not really sporty now. But yeah, I think for me initially, kind of in terms of, I don't know, like using my sexuality and gender, it was being cast in roles. And then I turned to writing and I started to develop my own material, did a piece of work where I played a sort of thief and a drag king kind of character. And it was a piece called Lunatic that Joel directed. We did that as part of festival, a visual theatre, and it was site specific. And that was kind of late 90s. And that's the London Arts Board was going at the time. And it was the first time I got any funding for anything. And I felt like a millionaire, do you know what I mean? To kind of make work about gender and sexuality, and got this check for £15,000. And I thought I was a millionaire. So I think, and obviously we came out of the Thatcher era as well, where it felt like we were just under attack the whole time. So any way that you could push out gender and sexuality and go against, clause 28, section 28, it just felt that was a galvanizing time. And obviously Rebel Dykes the documentary's been made out of that period of time, and, you know, Greenham Common and all the rest of it. So I think that it felt like part of that cluster of political action, as well as gender and owning your own gender and sexuality. And then I kind of, I formed a press with a trans masculine friend of mine called Serge Nicholson. And we came out of, actually, we were just, originally how we met was working in First Out. So I was making really bad cappuccinos, and Serge was one of the initial sort of people to work and run First Out. And we kind of it came together just as mates, really, and drinking buddies. And then Serge turned around to me and said that he wanted to do a verbatim theatre piece about the trans masculine experience that would be like the vagina monologues, but interviewing trans mass characters. So we did something called the Trans Mangina Monologues in 2009, and that turned into There Is No Word for It, which was our first public, because we set up a press. So we did we published the script, basically. So There Is No Word for It came out in 2011, and there was a big sort of appetite for the work, because it felt like trans masculine people were making work about gender and identity. But we were doing stuff that was about a choral of voices, so not just solo performers, but a group. So we brought out that publication, and we did a launch down at the book club down in Old Street, and it was a free event, and we were just completely inundated. We were selling books out of bags for a tenner, and we went home with a bag of money like that in the back of a black cab, and we had, I don't know, 800 quid or so. It was like, and I left Serge in the back of that cab, and I was like, do not lose that money, because if you lose that money, we've got nothing at the end of the night. We were both drunk. So moving on from that, we just carried on with the press, because we felt like there was something in it. And now, of course, there are lots of indie presses and alternative presses coming up, but we were kind of just producing like copies of the work that we were producing. And then the Butch Monologues came up 2011. And I think when I was like interviewing butches, a lot of younger people, say in their 20s, didn't want to take on that term and felt that butch had a really negative connotation. You're man-hating, monosyllabic, emotionally unavailable. You're going to be, you know, aggressive, grumpy, nightmare. So people say it's a dinosaur term, don't want to use that term. And so most of the interviews that I took were for people sort of in 30s, 40s, up to 80s. I've got an interviewee in their 80s, and it feels that shifted. So it feels like terminology and language has become a bit more free flowing, and I think the butch identity is having another kind of resurgence. So in terms of the press, we're still making work around gender and sexuality, and I think we're going to continue to do that, whether that's sort of stage work, or we did something called Letter to My Little Queer Self, which was in pandemic with people stuck at home. And we invited people to write, they could write a letter back to themselves to say, I don't know, don't worry about that, this, worry about that, think about this in terms of moving into their queerness and gender identity. So it feels like I'm kind of making work about gender and sexuality maybe most of the time now.
Great, thank you. Well, that brings us to my next question, which is, you've all been reflecting on your experiences of personally of gender and sexual identity, but who were or are some role models for you in relation to gender and sexual identity? And also, how have they influenced you? Yassine, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think there's a couple that like very immediately come to mind. So I think maybe the first time I ever saw a Black queer woman on screen was in a film called Set It Off, and there's a character called Cleo, played by Queen Latifah, and she's bold, unashamed about her sexuality, is being sexual and romantic with her partner. In some ways, probably a little problematic in a like hypermasculine kind of way, but it was just like there was no shame around her as a character. And I think that's something that resonated with me. And maybe I'm only just actually, as I'm speaking now, recognizing that that was actually the thing that jumped out at me, was not only like, oh my God, what is happening here? This is possible. Two women. I didn't realize, like, what is that? I must have been like about 8 or 9. I definitely was, it's definitely a rated R film and I should not have been watching it. But it was just like the first time kind of seeing that. And then maybe that element of it as well, where this person was so wholly themselves, so wholly, butch, they're a stud or whatever you might have called them. But there wasn't shame about it. And, had this group of close female friends around her as well. And there wasn't this sense of like, oh, I have to minimize that element of myself in order to fit in with other women, which I thought was, I mean, yeah, I'm just kind of, it's, I think, hitting me now as I'm saying it out loud that there are elements of that really jumped out at me. In recent years, I've kind of come across Gladys Bentley, who is a performer in I think it's 1930s in America, and who performed very much in like suits and was a jazz performer. And yeah, would perform in suits and top hats and tails and things, and very openly had female partners. I think one point was this was in like the American in the 30s. So I think during the Harlem Renaissance and stuff. But was known to have had like even white female partners, and I think that at the time was still hugely progressive or hugely out of the ordinary. And so there's this kind of, again, if you ever see pictures of her and stuff, she's incredibly just powerful, bold, kind of in these suits, unashamed. Again, that element of pride and security and knowing who she was in a world where women at that period were obviously facing incredible hardships, being still deemed to be second-class citizens, especially being Black women at that period. And so that's somebody who recently, if just for the sartorial elegance of it, I've been attracted to or drawn to in terms of them being a role model. But also the people who really stood out to me as I think about it, especially as I was a kid growing up, actually weren't necessarily women or dykes or queer female characters, but were actually the flamboyant camp gay men that I was seeing. And that was very often the only representation of queerness that we would see in mainstream films. They'd often be sidekicks or comedic relief. But there was a sense of, and I'm thinking specifically, there's a character called, I think it's like Hollywood Monroe or something from Mannequin. And there's a couple other characters like that who were very often very flamboyant and perhaps a little bit over the top. But again, there was this sense of, I am wholly and entirely who I am, and will have had to have faced incredible hardships moving through the world as a flamboyant camp gay person, as somebody who is, wearing clothes that do draw attention to themselves. But yet I'm still going to do that. I'm still going to draw that attention because whatever comes my way, I'm going to face it as myself wholly. And there's something about that I think just really I try and embody in everything I do.
Thank you. Esther, do you want to?
Well, I guess my first role models were Humphrey Bogart and Errol Flynn and, long dead now men, movie stars that I wanted to be, swashbuckling and have a sword and, these kinds of things. There was in my early life, I didn't even know there was anyone else even vaguely like me. And then my first contact with other lesbians really was, I came out into the bar culture in 1959 in New York. And these butches were, they were amazing. And the femmes also. I mean, that was the prevailing model of who you had to fit yourself into. And it was clear I wasn't femme, so then butch, and I made friends, and I was only 19, and I really admired them. But there was a very big issue, and that issue was class. That was a working class milieu, and I wasn't working class. I was in college, and I was so attracted to the iconography. I mean, people were so stylish and glamorous, and you know, but I couldn't be that in college. So I ran away from it, you know, and I'm really, if there's anything let's face it, there's lots of things I'm bitter about, but if there's one thing more than anything else, it was all the years I wasted still trying to be heterosexual or still trying to present some sort of version of femininity until finally it was like, I can't do, you know, like I can't deny who I am. So those bar butches, though, were very influential. Not that I could really emulate that. And I didn't have any working class skills either. You know, I wanted to be an intellectual. So then my model became Gertrude Stein. And this was I discovered Gertrude Stein in college. And it was like, oh my God, this amazing woman and her partner, Alice B. Toklas, and they lived in Paris. It was so glamorous. And so for years, I was obsessed with everything about her. And then in 1990s, the whole trans phenomenon presented a new challenge. Like, is this who I wanted to be? I already was old, you know, so relatively speaking. So so that was another, they weren't role models for me. Of course, it's not, you know, there's all kinds of trans men, not just one kind. But I had to sort myself out in relation to that. And I realized that had I been much, much younger, when I was a child, I wanted to be a boy, that's it. You know, every day I thought, oh, if I was only born a boy. I didn't think I am a boy because that idea wasn't out there. That just wasn't, it didn't exist, that idea. And so I'm this girl that's trapped in this body, you know. So it's, we all have, according to our class, according to our race, according to these big sociological concepts, which are really powerful, we all had different experiences.
Yeah, thank you. Joel, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, I found that really moving. Thank you, Esther. And I mean, some of my experience is similar to that. It's about people who are present and around you. But what's different is I was born in 1967. So during that, I was around and at the right age during that wave of feminism that led to Greenham Common. I was a Greenham woman. I went to Greenham Common. I was part of the squat scene. So I was Libra. We were all part of this kind of the wider idea of Rebel Dykes. So we had so many role models beside us, but we also had big people like, you know, Leslie Feinberg and Stone Butch Blues, and even Radcliffe Hull. You know, that character of Steve. I was always striding after I read that book. I strode everywhere. You know, so we had that kind of writing, but also who was at the time Pat Califia. That writer's very different idea about masculinity from a sort of BDSM perspective and a leather dyke. And also, I don't know if anybody know the work of Dorothy Allison. Dorothy Allison's a hardcore femme and a brilliant thinker and a brilliant writer. And so she became a role model to me, kind of tutoring me in how to think and how to think about myself as a butch as well, because she comes from a very I'm working class, and she comes from an American working class kind of background. And yeah, I feel really, really privileged to have had the influence from all these different people. And now we're in 2023 and heroes are still coming out. You know, it's the kids this time, or the people on this panel, but it's people who are willing and prepared to find a way to be themselves. you know. And I think there are some real contrary thoughts that happen within our community. But like I said earlier, we're all part of the same stained glass window, you know, and if one breaks, we all kind of collapse together. So we have to do our best to support one another. It's really great to have these panels, because sometimes I forget these ancestors of ours, these human beings who absolutely changed the world, mean that we're sitting here right now. And I just feel really privileged about that, and about what's going to come. And listening to Libro and Francis talking, and Yassine in particular, and their excitement about the fluidity and about what's going to happen next, I just think it's a real privilege to be around.
Thanks. So Libro, would you like to talk about your role models?
Yeah, I mean, similar to, and thanks actually for that name check, Joel. I think that's got like Haklifia, Feinberg. For me as well, it was Romaine Brooks, Gluck, in terms of like how people looked, how people dressed. Also for like from the night, also in the 80s and stuff, as David's like Top of the Pops was massive. So in terms of like, not really so much the new romantics, but in terms of the styling and, you know, Ultravox and Steve Strange, David Sylvian, David Bowie, you know, the kind of the looks that were going on. Katie Lang was massive for me as well. Initially, I think I was like, as a kid, that was very male family that I was raised, 2 brothers, 2 male cousins. So I was always nicking their clothes, the Levi's and the cords and the hand-me-down stuff. My mum was trying to shove me into dresses, wasn't working. And in terms of nicking books off shelves, so Jean Genet was always huge for me as a writer. And another pop star that absolutely nuts for, Sinead O'Connor, was massive. Like The Lion and the Cobra came out when I came out, and I was like, oh my God, there's somebody with a shaved head who just looked angry and political. I suppose now, like moving forward, as Giles just said, there's like names popping up into the, Jack Haberstam was always there for me. Paul B. Preciado, I think's amazing. Ivan Cahote, Constance de Bray. Love Me Tender is this amazing book that's set in Paris, and about sort of like butch and queer identity. So I just think it's also looking out. Charlie Josephine is making work that's just presented at the Royal Court, Cowboys, and did I, Joan as well down at the Globe. So it feels like they're writers, you know, the ones that are smuggling through and getting stuff out. And it feels like, yeah, we can look around us and see that person's making work that's interesting, that person's, you know, doing sort of like covering ground that I think is going to be like make some traction, especially now when we're feeling it's also, we're up against it in terms of the political climate. Here we go again, like the political climate, the rise of the right wing. It just feels like we're under it again. So anybody that's smuggling material out and you just think, yeah, we're all in it together. As Joel said, we're speaking here this afternoon. Hopefully we just carry on these conversations, carry on pushing back.
Thanks. Francis, how about you?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention pop stars, because I was like, my sort of role model. So I was born in 1977, so I'm like 10 years younger than probably you two. And so Justine Frischmann from Elastica was my like, oh my God, you don't have to look like a girl. I mean, it's very complicated, you know. Do I want her as my girlfriend, or do I want to be her, or both, or neither, or, you know, like, so that is a grey area. But yeah, she was a big kind of like, oh, this is a possibility kind of moment for me. But then later, like when I was kind of thinking more about kind of gender identity in different kinds of ways, the people who really kind of inspired me were Kate Bornstein and Justin Vivian Bond, because they were doing a kind of transness that was not a kind of binary transition. As this is kind of like a very, it's so recent, but it feels like so long ago at the same time, in terms of like this sort of shift. You know, I thought, oh, if you're going to be trans, you have to be like stealth and very, you know, hiding, and it was all very stressful. And they were like, oh no, you can do surgery and this, that, and the other, and still be, you know, somewhere in the middle and blah blah blah. So it was like they were very kind of another kind of moment of, oh, you can do other stuff. So yeah. And then who mentioned Ivan Coyote? Yeah, Ivan Coyote and Ray Spoon's Gender Failure book really moved me in a sort of affirming kind of way. I really would always recommend that too. But yeah, lots of people, yeah, Halberstam, and then obviously because I'm a massive nerd, Judith Butler, in a very nerdy way, helped me understand a lot of things about myself over the years. Yeah.
Great, thanks all. Well, going on to the next question, Sally Munt, whom Esther mentioned at the beginning, is someone who's been really influential in writing about butch identities. And she wrote in 2021, as a butch lesbian, I used to think that it was not the outright homophobia that kills you, it's the withdrawal of warmth. It's the cold demand that you have to continuously fight for the right to belong, to be recognized and valued, to be seen as a person. There's quite a strong statement there. And I just wondered, does that resonate with you? Do you agree with her? Do you disagree? Esther, would you like to go first?
Well, there's a lot of things that kill you when you don't fit in. And but I certainly agree with that statement. And I really I learned a lot from Sally, reading Sally. So it's a shout out to her.
Bill, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I do. I think I do agree with it in terms of a very personal lived experience, not maybe in terms of, academic thought of any kind, but my own experience was one of exile growing up. It really was, to be ugly and exiled and to fight really fucking hard, not just in violence was very common. I'm from the Northwest. It was just a very common thing. Obviously it was kids my own age, but then it was elder men. And this was something that has followed me throughout my life. And it's only really as I've become older, so from my 40s onwards, that I wasn't really experiencing this sort of direct physical aggression anymore. But the constant aggression in terms of career, well, that's another matter entirely. When we have women on stage, they are there is an expectation of what they're going to do. And I do feel that as a, butch dyke, whatever this is, that it has affected opportunities absolutely and 100% in terms of, reaching mainstream. And I think that is true of the people on the panel as well. Some of them, Libro in particular, who's an exceptional writer and should have a TV series, but it's such a bloody fight to get this recognized as content and to be recognized as authors, and yes, but that's the point of each other. That was the point of the bars, that when we opened that door, we belonged, and that's what we see in one another. Whether we think politically differently, it doesn't matter. We recognize each other, and I think, so I think it has absolutely the withdrawal of love and warmth and opportunity is a brilliant way to describe the experience.
Yassine, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, it definitely resonates. And it resonates from within the wider world and in very obvious ways. Like we've spoken about violence, we've spoken about being ostracized, being told, we're doing things wrong, being also very visible targets because of just being kind of obvious representations of queerness. And for whatever reasons, with men, in my experience, that has always been or holds some kind of inherent challenge to their own masculinity or something. And so, they do get a lot of direct challenging and aggression from men, where it's like, that's something that I think we can all, from the sounds of it, relate to and unfortunately have experienced. And then within queer communities, I think that ostracization is still happening. where, you know, and to certain degrees, I'm finding there's being like a resurgence of acceptance and actually even like excitement about butch identities, butch people and dykes and stuff. But like for a very long time, you know, it was fine if you were a lesbian as long as you weren't one of the boy ones, or as long as you weren't one of the ugly dykes or whatever. And that was very much how it was when I was growing up. So there was still a sense of even within the community, you're doing things wrong. And then I don't know if it comes from a place of self-preservation, or just, you know, internalized misogyny and homophobia and everything else. But I find it even within other, or, and again, slightly less so now, I think things are shifting, but even amongst other butches and amongst other dykes, amongst other studs, where they're, particularly for me, when I'm in Black queer communities, there's almost been this sense of we are automatically and immediately in competition with one another, or we have to like destroy one another in order to survive or something. There's an automatic challenge rather than the sense of community and finding solace in the fact that we maybe have similar experiences. It's there, you know, there are times where I used to go clubbing, and because I'm quite flamboyant and camp, would be like dancing and whatever, and I'd have other studs coming up to me and being like, yo, we don't do that. We're like, you know, we stand against the wall and we look hard, and then, you know, the women dance. And it's kind of like, what are we doing? What are we perpetuating? What are you even talking about? And sometimes they would get quite aggressive. And I would find that very interesting because it's like, you might perceive me as being like somebody who's gonna like, you know, stand up to you, or you have to be aggressive towards, but like that isn't, what are we, like literally, what are we doing? And I think I'm grateful that I maybe it's to do with age, and as I'm getting older and I'm not necessarily in those spaces anymore, hopefully there is just more conversation happening, and so people don't feel that immediate sense of, I don't know, like I have to be the last one standing or something, or maybe, yeah, I don't know where it comes from, but I've definitely experienced it for a long time, and to a point where actually for a very long time I did feel incredibly isolated. Because even within queer spaces, and I was still, you know, being told that like I wasn't appealing, I wasn't attractive, I was still doing things wrong, whatever. So yeah, I think it definitely resonates, and kind of in lots of different spheres. And I think that is part of the reason why I went and have gone so internal in my own sense of like, okay, well, I'm basically not going to be accepted anywhere, so I need to be really like have this strong sense of who I am, this sense of like security in how I'm going to keep putting myself forward in the world. Because like for me, it isn't a choice, but there are ways in which I could probably, you know, alter how I look a little bit and been a bit more like, I guess, socially acceptable. But I can't do it. So it was like that sense of having to come to terms with that in myself, and then choosing to accept that, yeah, there might be that constant sense of isolation. I do think it is changing now, and I think it was Jolie said earlier about like you just being in this space, being able to have these conversations with compassion and care and love with other people who are, you know, masculine centered, butch, you know, embody female masculinities, whatever you want to call it. But for me, this is still an unusual space.
Thank you. Libra, would you like to come?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think also what we seem to be touching on is like context as well, because like, as I say, in my family, it was like, there was no way that I could want to wear those clothes. I shouldn't want to wear those clothes. I shouldn't want to, I think as Esther was saying, you know, I have to go to bed at night and cross my fingers, cross my toes, cross my eyes. Tomorrow I'll wake up and I'll be a boy. All those kind of desire, everything kind of it felt everything was stuffed down, not allowed, repressed. I was berated, punished for having all those wants, dreams and hopes and desires. And then kind of like stepping into a space where like start to own masculinity, start to own like at the time, like being a tomboy, and then being butch, and like going to the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, which I didn't know any queer people. I stepped into there and I was literally wearing the uniform at the time, which was like 501's white t-shirt, black DMs and a bomber jacket. And it was suddenly I felt like, yeah, people would like, then I felt like the sense of community, the sense of acceptance and warmth. It's like, oh, this is my family. This is where I belong. That, I don't know what that was about, but this is where I belong. So I still feel that you can drop in and out of those spaces. Work down at Ducky, at the club once a month, last Saturday of every month, always suited and booted on the door. Always the gay boys come in, you know, you get a response, any queer people come in, but also then you can travel back on the tube suited and booted, and your experience getting the night tube back home, certainly if you're traveling alone, you'd be picked off, isolated. What the fuck, what are you, who are you, how dare you? So you're back into that space again. So it can be a little bit like heaven and hell. And the warmth sometimes that I might feel, like say in a public space, if I'm suited and booted, and certainly if I've had a fade, is often from gay men, because sometimes gay men, I think maybe I read as a twink, which, you know, I'm delighted to read as a twink at my age. But so you can feel like maybe more like a sexual, and certainly when we were wearing masks, I was read as male for sure. So I think this sense of warmth, coldness and warmth and heat and chill, I think this is the lived, from my perspective, this is our lived experience, a daily lived experience.
Thank you. Frances?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I think about how I read in public, and my initial reaction to that quotation was that didn't quite chime with how I was like, do I agree with this? I'm not sure. And I think, I mean, I think then those things are not outright homophobia, but that is how homophobia operates. And I think, you know, I feel, you know, in my home life, I have a lot of warmth and a lot of recognition and a lot of value. And that's kind of where I get my, you know, the energy. But then, you know, outside of those spaces or outside of my kind of queer spaces, yeah, I'm you know, always the fattest, the weirdest, the queerest person in the room. And like, do you just get used to that? And now I don't read that as a lack of warmth. I mean, I have a strange, like, I don't get a lot of street harassment, and that isn't ever something that I've experienced, but I know that, like, you know, lots of other kind of transmasc type people do, and definitely fat femme presenting people do. But I don't know whether I'm in some kind of weird kind of twilight zone where I'm just invisible generally. Yeah, so yeah, it's a very it's a really interesting thing to think about. And I'm really kind of stumped by the quotation, and whether whether I fight to belong, or do I just get on with it? I just don't know. Yeah,
it's also interesting to think how things become so normalized that we aren't always conscious of them in the same way as well.
Well, yeah, because I mean, I've always looked like this. However, I've identified, when I identified as a lesbian, and then queer, and then, you know, basically all of the things, and yeah, that's been my whole adult experience. I've never known any different. So yeah, now I'm thinking, oh God, where's my warmth? But I'm good, you know, generally.
Well, that brings us on to the next question, which is, what are your thoughts on aging as a butch, queer, masculine of center, however you identify, non-binary person? So, and I know that we've got different age groups represented here among all of you. Esther, would you like to kick that off?
Well, I am kind of the expert on this in this group. I think aging is very difficult for both butches and femmes for different reasons. Certainly, I remember very well in the 1980s for a while, and this was a very important event for me. I was in a group of self-identified butches. It was sort of like a CR group. And we were all in our 40s at that point. And there was this one dyke that was in her 60s, maybe. Let someone else,
Um,
let someone, I'm having a door issue.
okay, sure. Joel, would you like to?
Yes. Yes. Aging. Yeah. So I think aging is really difficult for women in general, and irrespective of our gender identity. You know, we are female at core, and we know we're going to be treated differently. I actually think that as a butch, masculine presenting, whatever these words mean, that I'm treated better as I'm getting older. It's almost as though they're giving me that kind of silver fox thing that you give to men. Like how, you know, like women get kind of pointless and ugly and men get kind of silver foxy. So I think we benefit from that within our own community. But for the wider society, you reach 45, 50, and it's a magic trick. You just completely disappear. And if you've always been like somebody who's kind of attracting negative attention, say, you know, out and in the street, that's a superpower, man. That's amazing that I can walk through these spaces and be kind of more invisible. So I think almost like the age becomes more important to people who are abusing me than the clothes that I'm wearing almost. But also, as I've got older, I've got more ability to protect myself. I can get a taxi home. You know what I mean? And I do these things that protect me. And I've also curated people around me who are, you know, we walk around in our little bubbles that protect ourselves. So aging is really difficult. What's really, really hard, and this is very real, is the fact that, and why I said I'm female, is that aging has brought difficulties because of things that are happening to my female reproductive organs that are causing me huge problems and agony, and these things are coming up. So that's another aspect of it. And I think certainly myself, I talk about myself, I have been disengaged from my body, my female self, my entire life. I've tried to escape it, I've tried to hide from it, I've hidden behind it, you know, but there's nothing so like bringing you into the present as sort of a twanging ovary or something like that, you know. Yeah, so I'll let someone else speak, so I don't want to take up all the time.
Esther, did you want to finish what you were saying? You're muted, Esther.
So I was in this group that was huge, so important for me. We all identified as butch. There were 10 or 12 of us. It was just incredibly supportive. It was really, yeah, in lots of ways. There was this one woman who was in her 60s, and she kind of raised her hand and she said, what do you think about, you know, do you think that being older, it's harder to be butch? Nobody responded. No one wanted to relate to that. It was just like, oh, that's, you know, we're all fine and you're fine. And it's just, I've never forgotten that moment, because we didn't even say, tell us what you're thinking or feeling. It was just like cut off at the knees. And now I'm much older than she was then. And I do relate to something Joelle said, which is, in a way, aging because of the invisibility of older women. And I'm not always read as a woman. I've had bathroom problems, you know, and lots of problems, but I'm not seen the way I was as a threat, you know, I'm not as big, you know. I used to, like, I'd walk into spaces and it's like kind of every eyeball would be like, who is this, you know, and what does she belong here? And that, you know, it's like I'm old, and I also live in a community 6 months of the year that is all older lesbians, and that has advantages and disadvantages. But one of the disadvantages is the ambulance is frequently in here and taking people to the ER, including that has happened to me a number of times. So aging, first of all, aging is difficult, period, because of what happens to your body. And some things happen to everybody, you know. I was fine till I was 75, actually. I didn't have any medical problems at all. And then suddenly, you know, it was just like, I'll be fine for 6 months and then, you know, it's something else. I've had cancer, I've had this, I've had that, the other thing. So that's a common experience of old age. I think that I've had lots of experience with younger people, even though I'm retired from teaching, because of the film, and then going places with the film, and there would be lots of younger people there at certain occasions. And I think I still have a certain presence, you know, and I still sometimes get vibes of like, you're attractive, which is, you know, when you're 83, that really means a lot. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts about it. And one more thing is, you know, this is part of being part of consumerist culture. Yeah, I don't know who, you know, the new movie stars are. I don't know who you know, what's the latest song and all that kind of stuff. So you're sort of segregated out of what's happening in consumerist culture. That's not the most difficult thing about aging is the emergency room. Yeah.
Thank you. Frances, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, you feel like that. I teach an LGBTQ studies module, and the other week we asked the students, you know, where did they learn about queerness and how to be gay? And it's all, you know, Tumblr. And I felt so old. I was like, the internet didn't even exist when I came out. It was just like, oh, and students write things in essays about the dark days of the 1990s. And I think I was having a great time. Like, what was wrong with the 1990s? So yeah, it's very weird. And I've really kind of starting to be conscious of being, I mean, I think I've been middle-aged since I was about 24, but, you know, of actually being a lot, you know, the students remain the same age and you get older and older, right? So it's a very odd situation. And I also do some volunteer youth work as well, and so I spend a lot of time with young people, so I feel quite old quite a lot of the time. But yeah, I mean, on the menopause is a terrible terrible thing coming over the horizon. But I'm also I'm interested in like how as I age, I may or may not become more gender ambiguous, and I'm sort of excited to find out whether that will pan out or not.
Thanks, Libro.
Yeah, I mean, menopause, I think I'm through that. The silver fox thing I slightly relate to that Joelle raised. I've never felt particularly like muscular and strong, do you know what I mean? So an age, like my weakness is like, has always been there. So I don't feel weaker or less, you know, sort of, for a lack of a better term, virile or butch or anything like that. So yeah, it's just the aging process, which, you know, as Esther is like highlighted, is hitting us all the time. And like many queer people, you know, coming from a family of very high psychological and emotional need, you know, at some points in my life, I'm surprised that I'm still here. So there's also that conversation which I have with a lot of my friends who are like, I'm going to be 57 in April. A lot of my friends saying I'm going to be this age at this month, this year, but I never thought I'd get here. So I think that's also another sort of conversation that maybe a lot of us are having with ourselves and possibly with people that are close to us as well. So I think that's also to highlight in terms of the violence that we get from other people, and also our areas of self-care and radical self-care that we're all maybe hopefully trying to learn a little bit better as we get older.
Great, thank you. And Yassine?
Yeah, off that final point of, and that's kind of what has been running through my mind as everyone's been speaking, is I didn't think I would be here at this point in life. So it's a surprise. And in some ways, in most ways, I'm very glad that I am. It is a wonderful surprise because as I get older, I think I just don't care as much. I don't care as much as what other people think. I don't care as much about, like the small things that used to bother me, and even some of the big things that used to bother me and impact me. And it's not to say that those things have stopped impacting me. I think it's just, as you get older, as I said before, like you do have just life behind you under your belt, and so you are able to cope with things and to process things and deal with things in ways that wouldn't have done when I was younger. And I just think, I don't know, there's a couple of things there. Like, it's interesting to me because this is maybe the first time in a very long time that I think I'm the youngest person on the panel, which is very unusual. And so, not by much, don't let the face fool you, I'm actually not that much younger. But I think that's in itself is quite of interesting that actually when we have conversations around like female masculinity or butchness or anything, that actually it does tend to skew towards like an older crowd, an older audience. And there are, and we've touched on it in this conversation, the fact that maybe young people aren't, the language that people are using is shifting and changing. And I think that's interesting in itself. And so maybe it raises this question of are butchers, are we kind of a dying breed? Are we dying out? I don't think so, but maybe I think that in itself is a potentially interesting question. Or like kind of the last few generations who will embody it and maybe face some of the same difficulties, difficulties that we've touched on in this session. I do, wonder. That's just wondering out loud. On a personal level, I think what's happening for me at the moment is I'm kind of, we've talked about things like our bodies changing and the kind of phases of life that people go through. And I very recently experienced the death of my father. And my mother passed away when I was 18 and my father's recently passed away. And so it's a very interesting point being, I think, like thrust into real adulthood. And that's how I feel. Like even before that, there's always a sense of, obviously, even though you're an adult, there's still some sense of security. And I didn't necessarily have a close relationship with either of my parents, but there was still some sense of I'm somebody's child. And now it feels very strange to be in a place where it is like actually, if anything, I think sometimes I feel that a lot of my family look to me almost as to kind of step into this like paternal role, which certainly does relate to me to like being butch and masculine, whatever. And I don't think that anybody is kind of doing that deliberately or really putting much thought behind why that happens. But I think I maybe am putting pressure on myself to kind of step into this role of, I guess, taking on like the fathership role or whatever, and taking on responsibility in a way that I think definitely does relate to kind of masculinity and traditional ideas about like being strong for everybody and things like that. That interestingly, other people might relate very strongly to femininity. And so I guess maybe there's questions around that. But yeah, I guess that's just sort of where I'm at in my life and things that come up, especially around aging, because I'm starting to also see it in all of my other friends, whether they're straight, whatever, who are kind of entering this period of life where, we are getting older and kind of older family members are dying out. And so there is these questions of, so who am I then? And what is my legacy? And what do I leave in the world? What is the mark that I make? And how do I represent myself fully and wholly as myself? Because some of the things that might have impacted us as we're growing up aren't necessarily as important, and we're being faced with these other larger questions of, who are we in the world and what does that mean?
Thank you so much. I think we've got time just for one more question. But I wanted to ask you about equality and intimate partner relationships, because I think particularly butch femme relationships, for example, are always stereotyped as sort of mimicking heteronormativity in quite negative ways. And there's always that kind of resistance to that, complete misinterpretation of those sort of relationships. But it occurred to me that you don't very often hear discussions about intimate partner relationships and equality in sort of butch masculinist-centered discussions. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that in there and hear what your thoughts are on this. Joel, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we all know what the stereotype is, that it's kind of aping, it's the eroticization of power difference, isn't that what Sheila Jeffries calls it? God bless her. All who's sailing on. So the femme is as gender non-conforming as the butch. The femme is as radical and as revolutionary. Both the butch and femme are women. They're lesbians, and they're in this relationship. I know I'm not speaking for everybody on the panel, so I'm just speaking about my experience. This is what it is for me. There is an issue with internalized misogyny. I know this because, hello, I have had internalized misogyny. It took a long time. I rejected the female because I felt, as a sexually abused girl, that I was being sexually abused because I was a girl. So I rejected it all. And I'm still to this day, I guess it's what you would call dysphoria. I'm uncomfortable with parts of my body, etc. Well, that internalized misogyny needs to be challenged. And it certainly can't spread out, So I am aware that there are some problems within some, butches where their relationship to women in general I don't think is very positive, very healthy. And I wonder whether it's because of mimicking what we think masculinity is. And it's not, I wouldn't say it's a huge problem. Some of you may disagree with me. And also it's a difficult question to ask because it's almost giving it validation. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I'll just end it with that both are equally as gender non-conforming and as radical and as revolutionary.
Thank you. Frances?
Yeah, my situation is that I've been with my partner for 29 years. Yes, we were like children growing up together. And it's interesting because the butch femme dynamic is not really what we embody, but it kind of is. It's then like, part of kind of female masculinity or butchness, or however I've kind of understood it over the course of that's quite a long time, right? It kind of is animated in part by the femme side. So it's like, well, you can be butch without a femme, but it's a different way of finding your way through that kind of way of identifying or understanding how you kind of fit into the world. So yeah, it's an interesting question about whether the kind of butch femme dynamic, and what are the gender dynamics of a partnership where neither of you are really that bothered about gender at all, to be honest, and like you've kind of formed your own world where you've invented your own versions of gender, and so there's no kind of significance to who does what, and I do all the cooking, but also all the finances, so it's like, what does it mean anything? I don't know. So yeah, intriguing kind of question. I think that's all I have to say.
But actually that relates to some social theory which argues that lesbians, for example, come up with creative ways of negotiating gender in intimate partner relationships.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think that's obviously I've had a long time to do that, and so yeah, I think it's I think my life would be very different if I had to renegotiate that with different people. Yeah, it's an interesting.
Esther?
I really relate to what Joelle said, that the femme position is really powerful. And as I've written about, this is how I realized that there was some way that I could be desirable, because I saw in them that they desired me. So I had to kind of think about, oh, I'm not ugly, like I thought, or this fake crap that I had to put on to try to attract men. Oh, that was so horrible. And so my experience of femmes is, on the one hand, the stuff that they face and have to deal with is really different than what we as butch or female, masculine or whatever, like they can pass. And that's a huge difference. I can't pass. I walk into a room and everyone's like, who is she? Kind of, well, not so much anymore, because now I'm old. I'm just old. But but the stuff they have to face, not being listened to, all the stereotypical misogynist stuff, but within themselves, they are really powerful. And I've never been dominant in any relationship I've ever been in with a femme. In fact, they can be pretty bossy. You have to kind of, hold your own space sometimes. So those are my thoughts about that.
Thank you. Yasin, would you like to come
in? Yeah, a couple things are really related there. I think as I think about this, two of the maybe most impactful relationships that I've had recently have been one with somebody else who was more masculine presenting, and then somebody who was incredibly super high femme presenting. And very interestingly, obviously both kind of brought out very different dynamics, very different sides of myself. But also in ways that allowed me to be very fluid and to fluctuate within that and within beyond the confines of this mimicry of heteronormative relationships, because that obviously just wasn't what we were doing, and in many ways it had literally nothing to do with that. It was entirely its own exploration, and in many ways it was also very playful and fun, being able to explore elements of maybe softness or relinquishing dominance of power, or at certain points also really taking it on in this kind of very performative way, but in a way that was obviously entirely consensual and entirely actually very well thought out as to why we were taking on certain roles and certain expectations, but all of it felt quite I guess tongue in cheek, or quite actually, people would look at us and perceive us as being the one thing, but actually in terms of who we actually are and how we actually interact with each other, it's doesn't relate to that at all. So I think that was something interesting that came from both of those situations. With the person who was more masculine presenting, it was kind of almost this dance, this back and forth of almost wrestling constantly to be a little bit more dominant, but then actually knowing that neither of us really wanted to be. But then also, why is that integral part of relationships? Why does there need to be somebody who's dominant? So it raised all those kinds of questions, which I think, have just continued to be interesting, continue to be, particularly in terms of how I see, I guess, myself and relating to other people. And then generally speaking, though, I would say that it's not something that I'm hugely concerned about, in terms of, and I fully understand why historically it has happened that the butchers get for the femme, and that's how it is, and there's no other options or whatever. But I think it's also very interesting just seeing how things are shifting nowadays, and there's all these conversations around T for T and trans people across gender spectrums engaging with each other and things like that, and kind of again challenging these perceptions and ideas of who holds what role in relationships, but also why do those roles exist? Who determined them? We're not a straight couple. We're not bound. Those roles do not even serve straight couples. So why are we trying to commandeer them in our own queer relationships? Yeah, it's been interesting, and it's definitely something that in terms of I maybe who I am and who I have been expected to be showing up in relationships is now completely different, because it's it's all nonsense, it's all made up kind of thing. So you might as well just, I guess, engage with the person you engage with, that, you know, you're engaging with in that moment, and yeah, just shake off some of the expectation and especially the perceptions, especially if you, like, as a butch person, you do find yourself with somebody who's high femme, like definitely trying to ensure that you're not doing that for other people and you're doing that entirely in a way that makes sense to you.
Thank you. Libra?
Yeah, just yeah, thank you, Yassine. I feel that's kind of closer to like some of the things you picked up on, closer to my experience. Yeah, definitely the femme is a radical perspective, gender identity, and incredibly like the curation of that and the power of that, as Joelle and Esther said, you know, the legacy of that, similar to a butch experience. But also for me, I know that if the stereotypes are kind of thrown on me, then I will resist falling into those very obviously sort of like binary kind of structures in around butch femme. And pretty much like what Yassine said, I like this idea of play and fun, and also being seen, being heard in the moment. So if you throw on expectations on me and I throw them back on you, we're going to get trapped in these kind of unhelpful cages, really. And some of the stories that we unearthed in the Butch monologues is about butch also being a trap. And so I think any sort of gender identity to some extent is also a trap, and just to be in the here and now with someone, and also disrupt what we're meant to be. And certainly going back to one of Joelle's points, always kind of aware of this idea of toxic masculinity and some of the things that we've talked about, seeing other butches as rivals, and just really what we're doing. You know, we need to sort of get over ourselves, but also try and be real and be in a space with different partners and different lovers who bring out different aspects of us that aren't necessarily just about our gender identities or about our sexuality.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm conscious that I've actually gone over time because I promised you all this would just take 90 minutes, and we've gone 15 minutes over, but that was so interesting. I couldn't bear to stop, really. And there are some questions in the Q&A that you might want to look at and take away and consider, but unfortunately we don't have time for. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you wonderful panelists for a really fascinating discussion. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And we've had an amazing turnout. There are over 100 people attending this webinar today. Most of them have stuck with us to the bitter end, which I think really shows how much they appreciate and value your contributions. And I have to say, I've never had so many people write to me saying, I really wish I could make this. Will it be recorded, and will the recording be available for any seminar ever? So that really, you know, is a validation of how popular this event is. And just to let everyone know that this will be transcribed, and an edited version will appear in the journal Sexualities as part of our interview series. And hopefully this recording will also be made available on the department's YouTube channel. And we're going to host a roundtable, more roundtables in future as part of the centre. And the next one, which will probably be in the autumn, will be on queer femininities. So we can continue some of these discussions from different perspectives. But just, yeah, thank you all so much again for a really wonderful discussion. And thanks everyone for tuning in and staying with us to the end. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to try and stop recording now.